4:15 local time, January 8th, 1945. Formosa Strait. In the pre-dawn gloom, under a low ceiling of slate-gray clouds, the sea runs in a heavy, confused swell. On the bridge of the Japanese tanker Seinan Maru, Second Officer Tanaka scans the horizon, his face illuminated by the faint green glow of the binnacle. The air is cold, thick with salt spray that coats every surface in a fine, slick film. Below his feet, the ship's old reciprocating engines throb with a tired, rhythmic beat, pushing the vessel north at a sluggish 9 knots. She is heavy in the water, her tanks filled with over 10,000 tons of crude oil from the distant fields of Borneo, a black, viscous fluid that is the very lifeblood of the empire. The Seinan Maru is part of convoy HY-87, a desperate procession of freighters and tankers shepherded by a handful of small, underarmed escort vessels. Their immediate stake is survival. Their strategic stake is the continuation of the war itself. Every gallon of this crude is destined for the refineries at Tokuyama, fuel for the dwindling number of aircraft that can still be put into the air, for the destroyers that still have the range to sortie, for the great battleships that now sit as silent steel fortresses in the Kure naval anchorage. Tanaka knows the route is a gauntlet. They call it the Devil's Sea. American submarines hunt these waters with a terrifying patience and lethality. The darkness that hides them is also the hunter's cloak. He does not know that just 12 nautical miles off his port bow, the conning tower of an American submarine has just broken the surface. On the bridge of the USS Barb, Commander Eugene B. Flucky raises his binoculars, the lenses instantly fogging in the damp air. He wipes them and looks again. The silhouettes are faint, smudges of black against a slightly less black horizon, but the newly installed SJ surface search radar has already given him their precise course, speed, and number. The radar paints a picture the human eye cannot yet discern, a convoy ripe for destruction. The hunt has just ended. The attack is about to begin. This single moment, a collision of hunter and prey in a storm-tossed strait, represents the culmination of a strategic reality that had been building for 3 years. By early 1945, the Empire of Japan was not a fortress. It was an industrial core desperately connected to its conquered resources by long, fragile sea lanes. From the outset of its Pacific conquests, Japan's primary strategic objective was resource acquisition. The home islands were famously poor in the essentials of modern warfare: oil, rubber, iron ore, and bauxite. The entire rationale for the southern expansion into Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines was to seize these materials and feed the ravenous appetite of its war machine. The plan was predicated on establishing a vast defensive perimeter, a shield of island airfields and naval bases that would protect the shipping lanes snaking back to the homeland. For a time, it worked. Tankers and freighters plied the routes from Singapore, Balikpapan, and Palembang, bringing the wealth of the southern resource area north. The primary artery was a route running over 3,000 nautical miles up the coast of Indochina through the contested waters of the South China Sea and squeezing through the narrow funnels of the Luzon and Formosa Straits before making the final dash to Japan. This was the empire's jugular vein. And by late 1944, the United States Navy knew exactly where to apply the blade. The American submarine force, after a painful early war period plagued by faulty torpedoes and hesitant doctrine, had evolved into the single most effective commerce-raiding weapon in naval history. The initial pre-war doctrine had focused on fleet action, on sinking enemy warships. But the realities of the Pacific War, coupled with the critical intelligence provided by codebreakers who routinely read the Japanese naval and merchant codes, shifted the focus. The new target was not the warship, but the humble Maru, the transport ship carrying troops, supplies, and, most critically, oil. Early patrols were often lone wolf affairs, a single submarine stalking a vast expanse of ocean. But by 1945, this had changed. The U.S. Navy had embraced and perfected the German concept of the wolf pack, known as coordinated attack groups. Submarines now hunted together, directed by command centers that fed them the latest intelligence on convoy movements. Technology had sharpened their teeth. The widespread installation of SJ surface search radar allowed submarines to detect convoys from beyond the horizon, at ranges of up to 15 or 20 miles, and to track them with perfect accuracy through the blackest night or the thickest fog. It transformed the submarine from a submersible craft that had to hunt by sight into a true all-weather predator. Commanders like Eugene Fluckey of the Barb or Richard O'Kane of the USS Tang became masters of this new form of warfare. They were aggressive, innovative, and utterly relentless. They understood that every tanker sunk was equivalent to destroying a squadron of aircraft on the ground or immobilizing a destroyer in port. They were not just sinking ships. They were systematically dismantling Japan's ability to wage war. The convoys they hunted were themselves a study in desperation. Japanese anti-submarine warfare, or ASW, was a generation behind that of the Allies. Their escort vessels were too few, too slow, and lacked effective sonar and radar. Convoys were often cobbled together with ships of varying speeds, forcing the entire formation to travel at the pace of the slowest vessel, sometimes as little as 7 or 8 knots, barely faster than a submerged submarine. The tankers themselves were the most precious and vulnerable targets. They were large, unarmored, and filled with a cargo that, once ignited, would burn with an incandescent fury. A single well-placed torpedo could turn a 10,000-ton oiler into a pillar of fire visible for 50 miles. The crews of these ships were often merchant mariners, men pressed into a naval war they were ill-equipped to fight, sailing into waters they knew were infested with unseen enemies. Their courage was immense, but courage was no defense against a Mark 14 torpedo. The contrast with Japan's own strategic situation was stark. While American shipyards were launching new Essex-class carriers and Gato-class submarines in staggering numbers, Japan's industrial base was beginning to crumble under the strain of war and the growing effects of the blockade. Fuel reserves in the home islands were already critically low. By the dawn of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy's fuel situation had moved from serious to catastrophic. The combined fleet, the once feared instrument of Japanese naval power, was consuming fuel far faster than it could be replaced. Every sortie, every training exercise, every movement of a ship from one port to another had to be weighed against the dwindling stockpile of oil. A navy that cannot sail is not a navy. It is a collection of static targets. The Naval Command in Tokyo watched the daily shipping reports with a growing sense of dread. The graphs and charts all told the same story, a terrifying, accelerating decline in imported oil. In 1943, Japan had managed to import over 16 million barrels of oil. By 1944, that number had been slashed by more than half. Post-war analysis would show that in the first quarter of 1945, the period of the most intense anti-tanker campaign, imports would fall to a mere fraction of that, a trickle too small to sustain even the most basic defensive operations. The tanker problem was an existential one. Without the oil from the South, the war was over. The American High Command understood this with chilling clarity, and they were about to apply pressure from a new direction, a threat from the sky that would complement the silent hunters from the deep. The submarine was a persistent attritional threat, grinding down Japan's merchant fleet one convoy at a time. But in January 1945, a far more immediate and overwhelming weapon was brought to bear on the tanker routes. This was the U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force, Task Force 38, under the command of the aggressive Admiral William Bull Halsey. Comprising over a dozen fleet and light carriers, screened by a powerful force of new battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, Task Force 38 was the most powerful naval weapon system the world had ever seen. It was a mobile, self-sustaining city of sea power, capable of projecting overwhelming air power hundreds of miles from its decks. Halsey, sensing the choke point, decided to take his fleet directly into the heart of the Japanese shipping lanes. On January 10, 1945, Task Force 38 slipped through the Luzon Strait and entered the South China Sea, a body of water the Japanese had considered their private lake for 3 years. The move was audacious. It placed the American fleet deep inside the Japanese defensive perimeter, within range of land-based air power from Formosa, China, and Indochina. But Japanese air power was a shadow of its former self, its veteran pilots lost at Midway and in the Marianas, its replacement aircraft starved of fuel for adequate training. The strikes began almost immediately. On January 12th, waves of F-6F Hellcat fighters, SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers roared off the decks of carriers like the USS Lexington and USS Ticonderoga. Their target was the coastline of French Indochina, particularly the naval base at Cam Ranh Bay, where intelligence reported a large concentration of Japanese shipping had sought refuge. The scene was one of total surprise and devastation. Lieutenant Commander Jumpin' Joe Clifton, leading Air Group 12 from the USS Randolph, described the target-rich environment as a skipper's paradise. Below them, anchored in neat rows, were freighters, transports, and the prize they were all looking for: tankers. The Hellcats went in first, their 6.50 caliber machine guns suppressing the meager anti-aircraft fire from the ships and shore batteries. They strafed decks, chewed up gun crews, and punched holes in superstructures. Then came the bombers. Helldivers screamed down from 10,000 feet, their 1,000-pound bombs aimed at the thin-skinned hulls of the merchantmen. Avengers came in low, on the deck, dropping their Mark 13 torpedoes into the water. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and true, striking the helpless ships amidships. Explosions blossomed across the bay. Tankers erupted in colossal fireballs, sending plumes of oily black smoke thousands of feet into the air, smoke so thick it stained the sky for days. A pilot from VT-82, flying off the USS Bennington, watched a tanker he had just hit. The ship broke in half, its bow and stern rising out of the water before it slid beneath the waves, leaving a burning lake of oil on the surface. Within 48 hours, the raids along the Indo-Chinese coast had sunk over 40 Japanese ships, totaling more than 130,000 tons. It was a massacre. And it wasn't over. Task Force 38 then turned north, steaming towards Formosa and Hong Kong, striking every port and convoy they could find. The sky was filled with American naval aircraft, hunting with impunity. The already perilous journey for a Japanese tanker captain now became a suicidal one. If the submarines didn't get him at night, the carrier planes would get him during the day. There was no escape. The combination of submarine wolf packs and carrier air power created a perfect storm of destruction, a synergistic assault that the Japanese convoy system simply could not withstand. While the carriers conducted their spectacular daylight raids, the submarines continued their methodical round-the-clock work. And among them, one submarine, the USS Barb, under Commander Fluckey, was pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible for a submarine to do. Fluckey was a true innovator, a commander who believed in taking the fight to the enemy in the most direct and unexpected ways. During Barb's 11th War Patrol in January 1945, operating in the Formosa Strait and along the coast of China, he demonstrated this with audacious flair. Observing that many Japanese ships were now hugging the coastline, sailing in shallow waters where submarines were thought unable to operate effectively, Fluckey took Barb right in amongst them. He navigated treacherous, uncharted shoals in total darkness, penetrating deep into Nam Quan Harbor on the China coast. There, he found a concentration of some 30 enemy ships at anchor. In a textbook surface attack under the noses of shore batteries, Barb fired a full spread of torpedoes, sinking and damaging several large ammunition ships and freighters. The resulting explosions were so violent they were felt on Barb's bridge miles away. But Fluckey wasn't finished. He had arranged for his crew to be issued with a supply of 5-inch spin-stabilized rockets. They jury-rigged simple wooden launch racks on the submarine's deck. After one successful attack, as Barb was withdrawing, Fluckey ordered the submarine to surface and conduct the first-ever rocket bombardment of the shore by a U.S. submarine. The rockets streaked towards coastal towns, targeting canneries and industrial facilities. The attacks were more of a psychological blow than a strategic one, but they broadcast a clear message. No part of the coast was safe. Fluckey's most legendary act, however, was yet to come. Later in the patrol, he conceived a plan that bordered on the fantastic. He would land a shore party to sabotage a coastal railway line. He handpicked a team of 8 crewmen, all unmarried volunteers. They were trained on board the submarine, learning how to handle explosives and operate in darkness. On the night of July 23, 1945, off the coast of Karafuto, Sakhalin Island, the 8 men paddled ashore in rubber boats. They were a motley crew of electricians, torpedo-men, and motor machinists' mates, armed with demolition charges, carbines, and sharpened knives. Under the command of Lieutenant William Walker, they located the main coastal railway track. They planted a 55-pound charge under the rails, rigging it with a micro-switch pressure detonator hidden in the ballast. Their mission complete, they slipped back to the beach and paddled out to the waiting Barb. Just as they were being helped back on board, they heard the sound of an approaching train. A 16-car train carrying troops and supplies rumbled down the track and hit the detonator. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The locomotive, tender, and several cars were thrown into the air, a tangled wreck of twisted steel. The men on the Barb's deck cheered. It was the only time an American military force had landed on the Japanese home islands during World War II, and it was carried out by a submarine crew. For these actions, Commander Fluckey would be awarded the Medal of Honor and the USS Barb, the Presidential Unit Citation. Barb's exploits were a cinematic highlight, but they were part of a much larger, grimmer statistical reality. The war on the tanker routes was reaching its brutal climax. The numbers from early 1945 tell a story of complete and utter collapse. In January 1945 alone, American forces, primarily submarines and carrier aircraft, sank over 300,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping in the South China Sea and its approaches. This represented a staggering loss rate. For every 4 tankers that left the oil ports of the South, 3 would not reach Japan. They were sunk, their crews lost, their precious cargo feeding flames on the surface of the Pacific. By March, the situation had become untenable. The Japanese Naval High Command made a fateful decision. They suspended all escorted convoy traffic south of the Formosa Strait. It was a de facto admission of defeat in the war for resources. The main artery had been severed. The trickle of oil that still came north was carried by small, fast, individual vessels, often traveling at night, and hoping that luck alone would see them through. It rarely did. The impact of this logistical strangulation on the Japanese home front and its military was immediate and profound. The war effort, which had been stumbling for months, now ground to a halt. In the cities, civilian fuel rationing became extreme. Charcoal-burning cars, once a novelty, became commonplace. Industrial production, already hampered by B-29 raids on factories, slowed further as coal and oil deliveries became unreliable. But the most dramatic effects were felt by the military. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Forces, which had once dominated the skies of Asia, were effectively grounded. Training for new pilots, already truncated due to a lack of instructors and modern aircraft, was now often conducted in wooden gliders or simulators because there was no aviation gasoline to spare. Veteran squadrons found their flight time cut to a few hours a month, barely enough to maintain proficiency. Airfields across Kyushu and Honshu were lined with hundreds of aircraft, fully armed and ready, but with empty fuel tanks. They sat as silent monuments to a starved war machine, waiting for an invasion that would come, unable to fly to meet it. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the fuel crisis was the final, ignominious chapter. The great naval bases at Kure and Yokosuka, once bustling with the most powerful warships in the world, became graveyards for a fleet that could no longer sail. The super battleship Yamato, the pride of the fleet and the largest battleship ever built, was a case in point. By early 1945, she lay at anchor in the inland sea. When the order came for her final suicidal sortie towards Okinawa in April, Operation Tengo, the fuel situation was so dire that naval planners could only allocate enough fuel for a one-way trip. The Yamato and her small escort were given just enough oil to reach the battle area, with no provision for return. She would sail until her tanks ran dry, then fight as a stationary fortress until destroyed. Her fate, sunk by waves of American carrier aircraft long before she reached Okinawa, was a microcosm of the entire Navy's plight. A powerful weapon rendered impotent by an empty fuel gauge. Other capital ships suffered a similar fate. The battleships Nagato, Issei, and Yuga, along with several aircraft carriers and heavy cruisers, were moored in Kure Harbor, covered in camouflage netting in a futile attempt to hide them from American bombers. With no fuel to maneuver or escape to the open sea, they became little more than static artillery platforms. When Task Force 58, the new designation for the fast carrier force, began systematic raids on the Japanese home islands in March and July 1945, these immobilized warships were priority targets. Pilots from the USS Essex and USS Yorktown described attacking the anchored fleet as shooting fish in a barrel. They systematically pounded the helpless ships with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, sending most of them to the bottom in the shallow waters of the harbor. The once mighty combined fleet died at anchor, not in a great naval clash, but because its lifeblood had been drained away, thousands of miles to the south. The final turn of the screw in this campaign of logistical strangulation came not from the sea, but from the sky, in the form of a new and devastatingly effective weapon, the aerial mine. By the spring of 1945, General Curtis LeMay, commander of the B-29 Superfortress Force operating from the Marianas, sought a way to complete the blockade of Japan. While his bombers were incinerating Japanese cities in massive firebombing raids, he initiated Operation Starvation. The plan was simple and brutal. B-29s, specially modified for low-altitude night missions, would drop thousands of advanced naval mines directly into Japan's harbors and critical waterways. The primary target was the Shimonoseki Strait, the narrow channels separating the islands of Honshu and Kyushu. This strait was the final gateway for any and all shipping from the Asian mainland and the south into the vital industrial heartland of the inland sea. Starting on the night of March 27, 1945, the mine-laying began. Flying singly at low level, using radar to navigate, the B-29s sowed their deadly cargo. The mines were a technological terror, a mixture of magnetic, acoustic, and pressure-sensitive detonators, making them almost impossible for Japanese minesweepers to clear safely. A single B-29 could carry up to 7 tons of mines, seeding a large area in a single pass. The campaign was astonishingly successful. Within weeks, the Shimonoseki Strait was effectively closed. Shipping traffic plummeted by over 75%. Ships that attempted the passage were ripped apart by underwater explosions. Harbors like Kobe, Osaka, and Kure were sealed off. What little maritime traffic had survived the submarines and the carrier planes now faced a final, invisible barrier at their own doorstep. The B-29s mined every significant port, turning the coastal waters of Japan into a vast minefield. By the end of the war, Operation Starvation had laid over 12,000 mines and was credited with sinking or damaging nearly 700,000 tons of shipping, a total comparable to the entire submarine campaign, but achieved in just the last 5 months of the war. Every route into Japan had become a death trap. The blockade was complete. The nation was isolated, its industry paralyzed, its military immobile, its people facing starvation. The end was now a matter of time. The defeat of the Japanese Empire in 1945 is often remembered through the dramatic images of island-hopping campaigns, of mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the foundation of that victory was laid in the long, silent, and brutal war of logistics. Japan was not ultimately conquered by a final, decisive battle in the tradition of Tsushima or Trafalgar. It was strangled. Its war machine was methodically and relentlessly starved of the oil that fueled its engines, the iron that forged its steel, and the food that fed its people. This was a new kind of modern warfare, one where the factory, the oil well, and the tanker were as much a part of the front line as the trench or the battleship. The victory was a testament to the industrial might of the United States, its ability to build thousands of ships, aircraft, and submarines. But it was also a victory of intelligence that read enemy codes, of strategy that identified the enemy's critical vulnerability, and of the courage of the men who executed that strategy. The sailors in the close, foul air of a submerged submarine, the pilots strapped into the cockpits of their Avengers, and the B-29 crews flying low over a hostile coast in the dead of night. They were the instruments of this logistical triumph. The collapse of the Japanese Navy was not sealed by gunfire in a climactic fleet engagement, but by the slow, inexorable tightening of a blockade that cut the steel arteries of an empire, proving that in the 20th century, logistics were not just a component of war. They were destiny.